The moment the bulldozer's blade sank into the school's foundation while kids were still inside, I dropped my wrench, kicked over my workbench, and sprinted to the front gate barefoot. That was my son's classroom, and the HOA president in the safety vest barking orders like she owned the place. She had no idea that by noon tomorrow her office would be a smoking crater. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how we got here. I didn't grow up with much. Just calloused hands, hand-me-down boots, and the kind of back that aches in the rain. But I swore when I had kids they'd get something better, so when my boy turned 6, small and curious with a voice that could outshout a tractor, I did what any stubborn father with a welding license and too much sawdust in his lungs would do. I built him a school. Not just him, of course, all the kids out here. See, our slice of land sat on the outer edge of what the city calls discretionary investment zones, which is a fancy way of saying you're on your own. Our kids had to ride buses an hour each way to a school with more metal detectors than textbooks, and after one too many budget reevaluations, shut down arts, music, and the only decent specialty teacher for miles. We'd had enough. A couple of us retired carpenters, old farmers, a teacher who used to run a Montessori before her roof caved in. We decided to build something. The Creekide School wasn't fancy. It didn't have a gym or a computer lab or an Olympic-sized anything, but it had windows that opened, desks made from reclaimed oak, a stove that ran hot in the winter, and a chalkboard big enough for every kid to dream out loud. And it sat on a lot tucked right between the woods and the bend in Dry Creek, technically within the HOA's outer margin, though no one had bothered to enforce anything there in 30 years. We cleared it ourselves, dug the post holes, hauled the beams, painted the walls with community-raised funds and leftover barn paint. Hell, I even welded the weather vane myself, shaped like a squirrel, because the kids voted for it unanimously. For a while it worked real smooth, too. We rotated teaching shifts between Miss Evelyn, who taught science with a slingshot and a rabbit skull, and Coach Donnie, who taught math like it was poker night. My boy learned fractions by cutting pie, not clicking apps, and everyone was happy. Well, almost everyone. Enter Karen, HOA president, as of last August, moved in with a purebred labradoodle and an SUV too shiny for our gravel roads, had a clipboard in one hand and a Bluetooth earpiece in the other. She had this way of speaking like she was announcing a fire drill, always smiling, always condescending. She started small notes about trash cans visible from the street, violations for unapproved porch swings, a letter about inappropriate holiday lighting because our neighbor strung up a nativity scene using a light-up inflatable possum, petty stuff. But then she started asking questions. What is this structure by the creek? She asked me once, squinting at the school like it was a meth lab. That's a one-room schoolhouse, Karen. I said, you know, the kind we had before HOA bylaws tried to gentrify common sense. She didn't laugh, started muttering about permits and liabilities and insurance exposure. She showed up to a board meeting with laminated photos of our playground, claiming the slide angle exceeded safety recommendations and could be a litigation risk. Someone overheard her say rogue daycare. A week later, we got a notice in the mail, cease and desist, no letterhead, just Willow Bend, host stamped like an afterthought, and her name signed in thick blue ink. It cited HOA Article 14 subsection F, which no one had ever enforced, and claimed we were operating an unauthorized educational facility in violation of community land use regulations. The kicker, that land had been vacant for decades before we turned it into something useful. She gave us 10 business days to shut down or face fines. Acrewing. Daily we tried to reason with her broad and parents' kids, even had little Becky draw a picture of the classroom with a sun smiling down on it. Karen didn't blink, said we could petition the board and request a variance, but made it clear she'd already filed for enforcement. I figured we had time. That was my mistake. The demolition crews showed up the next Tuesday. No warning, no mediation, not even a phone call, just a rental bulldozer, 2 guys in neon vests who looked uncomfortable, and a stack of orange cones with the HOA seal duct taped on, and the school. Our school was in session. My son was inside with 8 other kids, and Miss Evelyn teaching the water cycle. I saw her run out screaming before the first tire touched the gravel. I dropped my ratchet, ran full sprint from the auto shed, and threw myself in front of that machine like some kind of idiot superhero, waving my arms and yelling to shut it down. The driver, to his credit, did. He looked at the paperwork, looked at the terrified kids behind me, and just said, I thought this was an abandoned shed. Karen showed up 5 minutes later, probably summoned by HOA drone. She was filming everything on her phone and saying, this is what happens when people break the rules. She didn't notice the kids crying, didn't flinch when a mother collapsed to her knees beside a crushed lunchbox, didn't even acknowledge Miss Evelyn sobbing in the doorway. She just walked around, hands on her hips, muttering non-compliant architecture. That night, we took down what was left of the school by hand in silence in the dark. We salvaged what we could, packed the books, folded up the chalkboard, and laid the weather vane on my truck bed like it was a coffin lid. My son didn't say anything, just stared at the spot where he used to sit cross-legged during story time, holding back tears like a grown man in a child's body. That's when I knew this wasn't about rules, this wasn't about bylaws or permits or creek erosion. This was war, and I was about to show Karen that bulldozers go both ways. You ever try explaining to a 7-year-old why a grown adult bulldozed his classroom? I did 3 times each. Tom, my son, just stared at me like I'd started speaking a different language, one where sense and fairness had packed up and left. He didn't cry that night, didn't scream or throw a fit, just sat on the edge of his bed, clutching the little wooden truck we made in shop class, and whispered, "Well, Miss Evelyn still read us stories." I told him she would. I lied. The next morning, the creek-eyed lot was taped off like a crime scene, though you wouldn't know who the victim was by how the news told it. Karen had called Channel 5 herself. I later found out she was already giving statements before the dust settled, standing in front of the bulldozed rubble like it was a terrorist compound in her pressed blazer, an HOA-issued windbreaker. The structure, she said, lips tight, with professional tragedy, was built without proper permits. We have a duty to protect our community's children from unsafe environments. The anchor nodded solemnly, while behind her a swing set swayed in the breeze, and some kids' papier-mâché solar system laid flattened under a wheel track. An unlicensed facility, she repeated. No code compliance, no certified staff, no fire inspection. This could have been a disaster. I watched it from my kitchen, holding the mug my son had painted last Christmas, the one with my name spelled wrong. Half the town believed her, the other half was on fire. Parents flooded the HOA inbox. I know, because someone CC'd me on there. Reply: the HOA thanked them for their input, then doubled down, citing articles from their dusty rule book no one had read since the Bush administration. I tried the right way. First, I swear, called the city zoning board. They said the school was built on land still technically designated Greenway Utility Adjacent, which translated to not our problem. Tried the county office. It's a private development. They said your dispute's internal. I hired a lawyer. Well, I tried the first 3, wouldn't touch it. The 4th gave me a retainer quote that made me reconsider how much I liked justice. Karen had moved fast, sealed every crack. She had filed preemptive complaints with the city, claimed the school was erected covertly, and posed a credible safety risk, said we endangered children. That part stung the most. Miss Evelyn had taught for 22 years before retiring to care for her mother. Donnie was a war vet and a math teacher. And me, I was no rogue operator. I had credentials. What no one knew, what Karen definitely didn't know, was that I'd spent 2 decades contracting for the city, roads, bridges, public libraries. I'd built schools with my hands and watched bureaucrats screw up ones I didn't, and I'd kept records, relationships, favors. That morning, I called up Dale. Pfizer used to be city planner, now semi-retired and running some consulting racket in his garage. I didn't even need to say much, just told him what happened. He let out this long sigh and said, "Son, they really bulldozed it with kids inside." I told him yes. Told him about the paper trail, the fake fines, the emergency crew with duct-taped logos. Dale told me to meet him at the records annex. The annex was this cinder block box behind City Hall that smelled like mildew and bureaucracy. We spent 3 hours combing through microfic, then another hour in the vault. That's when we found it. It was wedged behind an old subdivision charter signed in 1974 by the original developer of Willowbend Estates, a guy named Herbert Langston, who apparently loved kids, hated rules, and insisted that any land parcel designated for the purpose of youth education or communal instruction shall remain free from regulatory override by local HOA or governing subdivision bodies. In bold, underlined, initialed, it was called a Land Use Preservation Covenant. And the lot we built creekside on it was shaded in blue ink. Herbie wanted a little red schoolhouse. Dale muttered, eyes widening, said if no one else built one, somebody ought to. Karen hadn't just stepped on a rake. She'd impaled herself on a century-old clause with teeth. The problem, no one enforced these things unless they were challenged. So I marched back to City Hall and submitted an appeal to the Property Commission. The clerk looked at me like I was dropping off a unicorn. No one uses these covenants anymore, she said. It's mostly ceremonial. I said, lady, there's nothing ceremonial about demolishing a classroom while a kid is practicing cursive inside it. Got filed. That same day, I wrote a formal letter to the HOA board. I cited the covenant, included a map and affidavit from Dale, and a notarized history of the parcel's designation. I CC'd Karen. She responded by calling it fake documentation and threatened to report me for forgery and defamation of board authority. I laughed out loud. Then I got to work, because here's what happens when you spend 20 years building other people's mistakes. You learn exactly how to unravel them. I filed for a temporary injunction with the county court just to stall her next move. Got the local paper to run a piece. 2 Father rebuilds community school faces demolition from HOA. A real feel-good hit, especially after I emailed them the video footage of Karen watching the demolition with a smile. Then I called every parent I knew. We organized, circulated a petition, held a candlelight vigil on the gravel lot. The kids drew signs that said things like "learning is not a violation," and let me read. Karen. Meanwhile, I worked nights and weekends pulling every record from the HOA's inception. Turns out Karen had been rewriting bylaws without a full board vote, and the emergency demolition, it hadn't even been approved by a majority, just rubber-stamped by her husband and the HOA treasurer, both of whom had business ties to the demolition contractor. The cherry on top, I found a memo from Karen 3 weeks before the demolition pitching plans for a private dog park on the very same land. Community space potential, it said. I printed everything, stacked it in a box, took it with me to the county hearing. Karen showed up with 2 lawyers, a print out of bylaws, and the smug expression of someone who still thinks they're winning. But when I laid that covenant down on the table and pointed to Langston's original signature, the room changed. When I played the footage of kids crying during demolition, the judge flinched. When I passed out notarized letters from 3 parents describing the trauma their children experienced after losing the school, especially after thinking they were in danger during the bulldozer incident, the judge stopped taking notes and just stared at Karen like she was gum on the courtroom floor. This isn't just a zoning mistake, the judge said finally. This is negligence, and it's possibly criminal. Karen tried to object, but her own lawyer grabbed her arm. I left that courtroom with a stay order, a pending injunction, and the green light to start laying the foundation again, legally, permanently, on land that Karen no longer had an ounce of control over. And the best part, one wasn't done, not by a long shot. Because if she thought she could erase a school with a bulldozer and a laminated rule book, then she was about to learn what a real demolition looked like, one legal clause at a time. There's a difference between getting even and getting it done. Right after the court ruling, after the newspaper article, after Karen had to issue a public statement that managed to not include the word sorry, even once I didn't yell, I didn't post, I didn't stomp through HOA meetings demanding justice. I disappeared. At least that's what Karen thought. But what I actually did was spend every spare hour out back behind city records in a room full of dead maps and zoning stamps, learning every code this county had on the books, because if Karen wanted to play the regulation game, I was about to show her what happened when someone who actually knew how to build things took over the board. First thing I did was lease a parcel of land beside the HOA office. Technically, it had been marked for utility overflow storage since 1992, but no one used it for anything but stacking dead Christmas trees and housing a raccoon family that smoked cigarettes. I swear one of them held eye contact with me while flicking ash. I submitted paperwork to clean up the shed on the lot. It was barely standing. The roof had caved and siding peeled off like an onion with rot. I filed every form: permit for restoration, permit for electrical inspection, permit for structural reinforcement. Not one neighbor questioned it because Karen didn't mention it. She thought I was fixing up a trash pile. Let me work in peace for once. I cleaned it out, restored the beams, rewired the box, repainted it in approved HOA beige. Just to be safe from the outside, it looked like a compliance office, or maybe a glorified tool shed on the inside. It was command central. I hung up all my research photos, violation letters, meeting minutes, every petty ruling Karen had issued since taking power. I started highlighting trends. That's when I realized it wasn't just me. She fined a third grader for having a visually disruptive Pokemon backpack that didn't match HOA-approved colors. She banned Halloween decorations due to occult symbolism and then approved a 15 FT inflatable turkey for Thanksgiving. The very next week, she made an 83-year-old war veteran replace his driveway because the cracks exceeded aesthetic tolerance levels. I put out the word quietly through the grapevine. I was building something, and anyone who'd ever been on the wrong end of a laminated citation was welcome. They came in pairs, then in groups. A dad who was fined $300 for allowing his toddler's tricycle to be parked within visible sightline of the curb. A teacher who got slapped with a notice Because her welcome mat had a pun, "Oh, hello there, a man who lost his wife last year and couldn't afford to repaint the trim in time." Before Karen sent him a 1-200 bill from the mandatory HOA aesthetic partner, I invited them and made coffee printed out. Complaint forms for every one of them, taught them the appeals process, taught them how to fight back. Then I called in some old favors I knew, people in procurement people and code enforcement people who'd spent the last decade getting bulldozed by HOA empires like Karen's. I asked the questions no one asks, like who approved the HOA office, who signed off on the original permits. Turns out nobody. Karen had retrofitted an old realtor's kiosk 3 years ago into a community operations center, never filed zoning updates, never cleared the setback limits. The office technically sat 2 feet too close to the greenway and 6 in into a shared public use easement. It was out of code in 3 directions and registered as a temporary modular space on city maps, which meant it was never supposed to have a permanent foundation or air conditioning, which it had. I smiled so wide I pulled something in my cheek. Because I had what I needed, I filed suit under the same covenant she tried to use against me, claimed the HOA office was in violation of public use zoning and had been operating without proper designation, submitted 3 photos, 2 affidavit, and 1 laminated county map older than Karen's Botox, filed for an injunction, wanted in 7 business days. Karen didn't even show up to the hearing, claimed a prior commitment. By the time the court ruling came in, I had already bought 2 bulldozers, 1 used Kamasu from a guy in Amarillo who wore a Crocs and Spurs combo like it was formal wear, and a slightly newer Deere with a cracked seat and an air freshener that smelled like bad decisions. Both were mine, both were legal, and both had permits filed to relocate non-permitted modular structures on non-conforming land usage parcels. I filed for removal attached. The court ruling got the green light. It was surgical. I showed up on a Tuesday morning wearing a reflective vest and the calm resolve of a man about to get biblical. The office was locked, but I had already issued a notice of operation through the county, posted it in triplicate, took pictures, waited the minimum grace period, and then I fired up the Kamasu. The growl of that engine was sweeter than revenge. Karen showed up halfway through. She came screeching into the parking lot in her Lexus hair, half-styled, phone in hand. "You're out of your mind," she screamed, stepping right into the caution tape. "This is criminal." "I've got the permit," I said, handing her the paperwork like a wedding invitation, signed, notarized, reviewed by county inspection office. "Is sitting on a non-conforming parcel in violation of Municipal Code 311B. Per the ruling, you've got 2 options: remove it or let me do it. This is abuse of power." She spat. "You're abusing your position to retaliate against." "Actually," I said, smiling just enough to be rude, "this is me complying for once." She screamed something into her phone. I'm not sure who she was calling, the mayor, her hairdresser, Satan. Didn't matter. The second bulldozer rolled in 15 minutes later, driven by Donnie, who hadn't smiled that wide since 8. Together we cut through the foundation like it was butter, ripped out the concrete, stacked the siding, and relocated the HVAC unit to the grass like a trophy. People came out to watch, kids on scooters, retired couples with folding chairs. One guy even brought popcorn. When the office came down, the whole neighborhood cheered. Someone played the national anthem. Someone else brought me a beer. I took a sip, standing atop the Kamasu like a victorious general, as Karen stood there frozen, holding a clipboard that no longer meant anything. I didn't say a word to her, just climbed down, patted the bulldozer like it was a loyal dog, and walked home through a line of neighbors high-fiving me like I just landed a moon shuttle. That afternoon, I mailed the HOA a fresh application, permit requests to rebuild the Creekide School, this time with city support, community backing, and an ironclad deed that declared the land off-limits to HOA interference. Karen tried to appeal. She didn't get far. Seems once your office is declared a legal hazard and physically removed, people stop taking your bylaws seriously. She held one more board meeting from her garage. Only 3 people showed up. One of them was just there to borrow a rake. The HOA voted to remove her by majority. She moved 2 weeks later, listed her house as is, sold it at a loss, and the raccoons moved into her backyard. I never saw her again, but every now and then when I hear the hum of a lawnmower or the distant chatter of a PDA meeting, I think about the look on her face when the office hit the ground. Bulldozer justice, we called it, and justice had never rolled smoother. The town never forgets a good story, especially one where the bad guy gets flattened literally. By Wednesday morning, the clip of the HOA office tumbling like a Jenga tower had gone viral. Someone added slow-mo and dramatic music a local dad edited, and Karen's face superimposed on the Death Star. "HOA destroys kids' school, loses office in legal counter move," screamed the headline on the channel. 7 News site, the comments were, stand up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's right. Sometimes the world isn't fair. Sometimes people in power mistake rules for righteousness and forget that communities are built on people, not paperwork. But when you see something wrong, really wrong, you don't walk away. You don't wait for permission. You act. Build the thing no one else will. Speak up when silence is easier. Learn the rules better than the people trying to use them against you. And if someone bulldozes what you've built with love and sweat and purpose, don't just get angry, get smart. Fight with truth, with grit, and if you must, with a bulldozer and a notarized map. Because justice isn't handed down, it's constructed, beam by beam, word by word. And no HOA, no clipboard, no laminated rulebook can stand against a community that refuses to be erased. Never underestimate the power of ordinary people who decide enough is enough.